Hey folks, I am Rebecca, blonde in the belly of the beast. I have my YouTube podcast co-host from the Matt and Blonde show, Matt Christensen. And today we are talking to the legendary RazörFist. I've been a fan of your channel for ages, but everybody was talking about this Abe Lincoln video. Like, you've got to watch it. And then I watched it. And I had read the real Abraham Lincoln just ages ago, but I still got a lot of new information from this video. It was so good. Information packed. If you wanted to give the audience, in case they're unfamiliar with you, a little bit of an intro, that would be great.
As far as the topic of Abraham Lincoln,
no, just yourself. I've got a ton of questions.
Yeah. I'm
Who are you?
I talk if it's a subject, I talk about it on YouTube. I'll talk everything from politics to comic books and pop culture. I'm one who is firmly of the belief that pop culture and politics should not be divorced from one another, and that vacating one has led to recession in the other. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem, right? Especially culturally on the right. The right began to abandon things like Hollywood and pop culture in the 1960s. And it's not a coincidence that it's been a long march through the institutions for the radical left ever since. Right. So pop culture and all of these things are, I think, completely important. I think people like Nerdrotic, whoever, I think they're arguably doing as important, if not more of an important service than some of the pundits on the right, because they're confronting the enemy on enemy territory, as it were. I very much talk about all of that stuff. I'm also an author now and working on a comic book project. So,
oh, that's great. Well, I'll link all those things in the description below so people can check it out. But on today's topic about Lincoln, I just wanted to jump right in. So why do you think that the establishment, including both parties and the educational system, are obsessed with deifying Lincoln? It's all I learned in school. What a great man he was. What a legend.
He's arguably the first president you learn about in school. Mm-hmm. I think he was the first one I learned about when I was a kid. I think. I think even before Washington, possibly. I remember my father, who kind of looks like Abe Lincoln.
That's unfortunate.
No, he's just a tall guy. You know what I mean? So he, a nice guy, no problems with him. But he used to dress as him on Halloween because it was an easy cosplay for him because he basically already looks like. Just wore a fake beard and a top hat. So like he's absolutely been deified. I think the reason why, to the point that the Lincoln Memorial, someone pointed this out, where I mentioned that in the Lincoln Memorial, he's literally sitting on a throne flanked by two fasces. But more than that, he's actually, if you look at the style of the structure and the fact that he's in this great big columned building, he's actually not. So there's a member of the audience who pointed this out in the comments section of the video. The thing the sculptor was going for was he's actually being portrayed as Zeus, king of the gods. He's not
God of gods. Yes,
king. Yeah, he's being explicitly deified, which is something that happened in the immediate aftermath of his death, because he was a very unpopular president during his own lifetime in North and South. Massively unpopular, massive riots, and he had to arrest around 13,000 of his own citizens in order to quell the disquiet using a secret police, the first of its kind in U.S. history. And so,
with that congressional painting, ascending to heaven.
Well, yeah, Congress in the immediate aftermath of his death commissioned that portrait. I thought people think, oh, it's just from like Harper's Weekly or something. No, Congress commissioned that. It's a portrait, and you can look this up. It's in the Library of Congress, I think, of Lincoln ascending to heaven, flanked by cherubs, with George Washington beckoning him into heaven. and great big next-gen video game god rays coming down from heaven.
I missed the Washington part. I got to check this out. I got to see
this. It's genius.
That's asinine. Good Lord.
Yep. Public taxpayer money was used.
Taxpayer money, yeah. But in terms of his legacy, I think the most destructive point to the legacy of Lincoln as the freer of slaves is that Lincoln never opposed Southern slavery. He wanted to preserve territories and wanted white Northerners to avoid competition. He was an avowed Northern protectionist, which you talk about extensively in your video. And he didn't care much about slavery until it became politically useful to him. Can you talk a little bit about the economic incentives for Lincoln's position on slavery and how these became enshrined as moral incentives in American history.
Well, nothing really makes this point more, nothing I could say, frankly, makes this point more than the first inaugural address for Abraham Lincoln, which is a big, big black hole that Lincoln defenders rarely reckon with. They'll talk about the second inaugural address until they are blue in the face and collapse. But they will never mention the first inaugural address. And once you read the body text of it, you realize exactly why that is. It is essentially a full-length, passionate defense of slavery, bracketed by repeated calls to invade states that refuse to pay their fair share of taxes.
Yeah.
If you don't understand the causes of the Civil War after reading that text, I don't know what can be done for you. Honestly, this is the problem really a lot of the defenders of Lincoln run into is they conflate two things, and we'll probably hear this later. They conflate secession and Civil War. These are two, we had a secession crisis followed by a Civil War. And the two things had two different causes. They're interrelated. One certainly fed into the other, but the secession crisis is distinct from the Civil War. So slavery, as I never made this point in my video, slavery was a cause of secession. I argued vociferously that it was not the primary cause. It was a cause, but not the primary cause of the Civil War. And I repeatedly made that argument. Whenever you have someone who's conflating two events like this, like they just happened within a week of each other, it absolutely did not happen. There was this uneasy period where we hadn't gone to Civil War, but the South had seceded, and there was this really awful kind of shaky stalemate that could erupt into violence at any time. And troops were landing in places in the South, and they were kind of vacating military bases. And Lincoln, another thing about, the beginning of the Civil War that a lot of people don't talk about is Lincoln had tried to reprovision a bunch of other forts prior to Fort Sumter. It was a whole series of forts. And we now have the manifests. They are public. They are in the Library of Congress. You can look them up. The manifests of what was being reprovisioned at those forts. And contrary to what Lincoln's secretaries said, or actually, I think it was John Dix said, Lincoln thought that it was important, and I'm quoting him now, that the South be seen to be firing upon food, right? Like these were just boats that were coming in with food on them. But contrary to that, the manifests have since showed us, no, there was actually like cannons and soldiers. And it's kind of like after the sinking of the Lusitania, when everybody found out that, there were war munitions aboard, actually. Even though it was terrible that they killed a bunch of civilians, technically it was a legitimate target in war, right? So it's kind of this situation where you get these two things conflated, and then it's a very short walk from there to, slavery was a cause of the Civil War, and it's admittedly cited by the 5 states that initially secede. But then you kind of have this short walk to, therefore it caused the entire Civil War. No, there was this whole period and this preponderance of things that happened that led up to the Civil War.
Yeah, definitely. And while everyone's kissing Lincoln's ass for ending slavery, few people are asking, what about the incredible loss of human life? And I'm of the opinion that Civil War was totally preventable. Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, French, Danish colonies, they all ended slavery peacefully. The federal government could have paid for the slaves and freed them like innumerable other countries. Do you also think slavery could have been ended peacefully?
Absolutely. And Lincoln even tabled it briefly. A lot of people don't realize this. He had proposed a plan for paid manumission, but this was kind of ludicrous. Keep in mind, this is the 1860s now. We're in like 1861-ish or so.
Right.
And he's tabling this because what had happened is that the South, apparently, there was a blockade of southern ports, as a lot of people know, that the Union had imposed. And the South started looking to their European trading partners because the South, as I mentioned in my video, had a huge economy, and it was largely as a result of trade with Europe. And I think trade with Europe was a big sticking point for Lincoln and the Union was, okay, now they're trading without us and we're not getting a cut. That's a problem, right? So anyways, there were now English papers that were reporting that the South had, I think it's the paper in England was called, one of them was called One a Week. Anyways, they were talking about how the Confederates had sent diplomats and that they were considering, or not even considering, but that it was on the table that the South would abolish slavery if England would break the blockade, if they would send in ships to break the blockade, because they were aware that optically it looked bad for England to be allying with a slave state, right? Because England had already, in just 5 years, non-violently ended slavery through paid manumission.
Right.
Now, a lot of people, and you'll hear this, I mean, there was a rebuttal to my video that immediately hand-waved this. This is something that the cult of Lincoln inevitably have to do to defend him. They have to hand-wave away the entire press of the nation of England. Oh, you can't trust any of them because they were trading with the Confederate, which is always a sign of being intellectually honest, right? Let's just hand-wave away the entire press from an entire country.
Yeah.
So anyways, the problem, of course, with hand-waving this away is that Lincoln reacted to it.
Mm-hmm.
He then met with a delegation of border slave states, right? These were going to be, I think they're called like the Northern Confederacy, by the Middle Confederacy, whatever you want to call them. They were almost, members of the Confederate Rebellion. And so, slave states, like whatever, just states in the middle between them. And when he actually met with them, he tabled the idea of manumission. And consequently, and this is on record, this is on public record, the delegation actually said they turned him down first off, but for a completely different reason. And they said, we are aware, and this is a quote, we are aware of a plan to end the practice of slavery if England will break the blockade. So this is a matter of public record. Like, clearly this was at least being considered. So in other words, if the South could be left alone, if they could have their independence, they were willing to give up slavery, or at least it was being discussed, right? So the fact that this is like even an argument is kind of ridiculous. It kind of makes it very, very clear what the actual core aim of the war was. If it was all about slavery, then they wouldn't have been able to give up slavery, or wouldn't have been willing to. So it kind of makes it more of, some people call it the war to prevent Southern independence, whatever you want to call it. But it was clearly, the watchword was independence at the end of the day.
Right, correct. And I think that there's an overestimation of how central slavery was to the South's economy. Arguments were made that slavery was more secure in the Union, in part because fugitive blacks were often from the North, or in the North, were often returned to the South by local magistrates. They had a financial incentive. They get paid $10 to return them and $5 for their freedom.
I didn't even mention that corrupt practice in my video. It's unbelievable.
It's unbelievable, right?
And so, a money racket.
Exactly. And so there's an argument to be made that if the South seceded, this practice would have ended anyway, and slavery would have fallen apart. Also, and we talk about this all the time on our podcast, but inherent to slavery is an inability to innovate. Slaves have no incentive to make practices better. They just they're there for the grind and everything like that. So I think it's fairly obvious to anybody looking at the situation, like slavery wasn't going to be an enduring practice in the event of a successful secession.
Yeah, and some of the evidence of that, some of the evidence of that is that it was beginning in certain states, particularly like North Carolina, to take on features of serfdom. Right. It was Southern slavery didn't look like slavery had in the rest of the world. It was starting to mutate into something else. Mm-hmm. There were like financial incentives. I've talked about this before, but Jefferson Davis's brother ran a plantation, and the foreman of it was a slave. And the way that the plantations worked in that corner of the South was that you had like a task for the day, and then once you were done with it, your day was yours. You could do whatever, right? And so in his spare time, this guy, I believe his name was Ben Montgomery, designed and patented, as a result of Jefferson Davis passing a law that allowed blacks to be able to hold patents, which, by the way, they couldn't in the North. Ben Montgomery was able to hold the patent for the steamboat propeller, and he made his nut coming and going, right? They sold, I think it was the Mississippi governor's mansion. I think they upgraded it. And the old one they sold on the market, and a slave was able to buy it. That's how much money some of them, again, I don't want to make it seem like it was a paradise on earth, because it wasn't. Even serfdom is bad, right? But they did have enough money. They did have financial incentives enough to be able to actually engage in alternate business ventures. And so it was, my point is, it was starting to mutate into something else. Either way, it would have been bad. But here's the good thing about that. if there's a silver lining in having a class of serfs, serfs are easier to free, right? Russia had just freed them several years before the American Civil War. So if it had mutated into serfdom, I think it would have been easier without even firing a shot or even having a civil war for us to probably free Southern slaves who at that point who would have been serfs.
That's true. And I don't want to act like being a slave was some better scenario, but it was a means of avoiding the draft. And I don't know about you, but in that situation, I would rather be a slave than, get my leg blown off in the Civil War, something I didn't want to fight for anyway.
And apparently a lot of people in the North agreed, because the draft riots are still the largest domestic disturbance in the history of the United States.
Right.
Hundreds of people died in that, in the immediate aftermath of Abraham Lincoln basically announcing a policy where, you had to be in the military if you were of a certain age, but if you paid someone or you were connected to the government, you didn't have to. Where we heard that before, right?
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about what made Lincoln so dictatorial. I mean, he conducted a war without the consent of Congress. Everybody knows that. There was judge intimidation after he suspended habeas corpus. He imprisoned 30,000 Northerners without trial just for voicing opposition to the war. There was he closed down all of these newspapers through force and vandalism. Destruction of their property.
The era.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It was just gangster violence. I mean, he was orchestrating just straight up like rape and looting gangs and never commenting on it. So what do you think are Lincoln's most egregious violations of what we would consider to be constitutional values?
I mean, probably the two big ones, the terrible two, are the suspension of habeas corpus without the consent of Congress. And then the Congress basically acting as a rubber stamp several months later. I think that's even more disgusting than Abraham Lincoln unilaterally assuming the powers of a dictator. For those who don't know, months after Abraham Lincoln had already suspended habeas corpus, had already given himself emergency dictator powers, then the Senate finally, the radical Republicans finally get around to voting on whether or not he's allowed to have them. And this is one of the most clown shoes sessions of Congress in American history. They literally open by saying, well, Abraham Lincoln's already using the powers, so the motion stands. We're going to adjourn right now. Didn't even take a vote. And then they just sit there for hours, and because they still have some time left, and all the opponents across both sides of the aisle, because again, Abraham Lincoln, I can't stress this enough, at this time was very unpopular in the North. And so a lot of people, opponents on both sides, just voiced their displeasure for hours and hours and hours. And Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans just kind of file their nails and laugh at him.
Yeah.
That's basically all that happened. It was one of the most blatant power grabs in American history. So and then I think the fact that I forget which article of the Constitution is, but it's the article that stipulates that the president must, quote, take care that laws be faithfully executed. That was Lincoln's excuse for why he was allowed to have dictator powers. That was his interpretation of the Constitution. Mind you, it was an interpretation that no previous president facing secession or a secession crisis, as James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had during the New England secessionist movement several years previously, none of them saw that power. It took Abraham Lincoln to come along with a magnifying glass and say, wait a minute here, I've got this power. The founding fathers didn't think I had this power, but I know better than the founding fathers, which is a familiar theme over the course of the Abraham Lincoln presidency.
Indeed, yes. And that's not even to mention the things that he did for personal enrichment, this railway program. He was doing all sorts of things to enrich this really centralized organizations, which nobody ever talks about, especially railways. And then supporting that state program in Illinois to colonize or deport free blacks out of the country. No one ever talks about that. I mean, Emancipator, Lincoln.
There wasn't one black code in the state of Illinois that Abraham Lincoln didn't vote for when he was a state level congressman. Not one. And he was an eminently corrupt railroad lawyer. I mean, really, that's kind of the encapsulatory statement. We could almost stop there just at the idea of, how do you know you've been gaslit about Abraham Lincoln? Here's how.
Right.
You have been persuaded by public school teachers that the only president worthy of having the word honest attached to his nomenclature is a railroad lawyer in the 18th.
I know, right?
A lawyer, and not just a lawyer, but a
exactly.
lawyer for railroads, the most corrupt business of that era. I mean, that
and terrible
really
humanitarian practices, of course, right? This is just terrible. Yeah, I mean, it should be obvious by now that he was a big government guy. Nobody talks about that. In favor of a national bank, government subsidies to railroads. He basically advocated for the creation of money from thin air. Was his advocacy, this is kind of a rhetorical question, but I want to hear your answer anyway. Was his advocacy for big government policies a manifestation of his own desire for personal and financial advancement, or were some of his actions based on a restructuring of the American experiment that he believed would better suit the nation?
He was a Henry Clay man, and Henry Clay was an Alexander Hamilton man.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that's really what it comes from. It's something called the American system. It's a Hamiltonian idea where basically the federal government is at the top and power flows down from it to the states. If that sounds familiar, it's because that's the system that triumphed after the Civil War, and that's the system we're living under today.
Yes.
I believe and so what had to die before that could happen? The right of secession. And
nullification.
There's no way you can do that if any state can secede at any time. And so the great misnomer of the American Civil War is that everything Abraham Lincoln did, he did in order to save the Union. But the problem is the Union was voluntary. The Union, it's abundantly clear that the Union was voluntary. Several states, at least 3 of them. For one, the votes that were taken to join the Union were a near thing. I think New York barely voted to join the Union. I think by a handful of votes, and by a handful, I mean like 2 or 3, something like that. Right. And Rhode Island weren't far behind. It was I know one of those states came down to 1 vote. So at least 3 different states almost didn't join the Union. And several of them, I think it was 2, but for sure Virginia did, had it put into their state constitution that they could leave at any time. Right. And they were allowed to join the Union under that arrangement, right? So if they weren't allowed to secede, then why was Virginia allowed to join? If it was a condition of joining the Union that it was involuntary once joined, then why was Virginia allowed to join? That wouldn't have made any sense at all. And of course, the answer is that the Union was completely voluntary. Thomas Jefferson wrote about this many times. There was talk of a portion of Mississippi seceding, and Thomas Jefferson in his private writings said, fine, let them secede. I think we'll eventually join back up anyways, because I think we're better together than apart, but let them secede. And he's not the only one. George Mason wrote about it. James Madison wrote about it.
And there was a lot of discussion around the War of 1812 as well in terms of secession. So this wasn't really the first time this has been discussed. And of course, we're a nation built on secession. Did you want to jump in, Skag? It looked like
these are the exact themes that I wanted to ask about, because a lot of the pushback that I hear is, or at least the attempt to frame is the wrong word, but to characterize the South as the aggressor is denying the right to secession. That by seceding in the first place, that was an act of aggression, thus justifying several of the things that happened thereafter. And I certainly I think that it's perfectly consistent with the principles, the moral foundation of the founding, to think that secession would be an implied right. I just wonder why this was not constitutionally clarified. It's a great mystery of the Constitution.
Well, oh man, this is actually a whole hill of beans, but yeah, it really comes down to, and this was probably a mistake of the founders who were not perfect. The philosophical framework of our country has turned upside down, right? The philosophy when writing the Constitution was this, it was not, as we assume today. Even defenders of the Second Amendment, in a weird way, the Second Amendment, and this is an argument that is made. I'm not sure I'm in complete accord with it, but it's an argument that is made, and I think there is some merit. That in a weird way, the Second Amendment is kind of an obstacle to gun rights. And here's why they make this argument. Because by having the Second Amendment be the only thing that's keeping our gun rights together, you're really giving all the power of your rights over to the federal authority in Washington rather than to the state level. The founders didn't see it that way at all. The Constitution was a list of things the federal government was allowed to do. Everything else was assumed to be the power of the states. So we've inverted, right? And this is actually a function of the Civil War. It's actually apropos to this discussion today because Abraham Lincoln, to a large degree, is a facilitator of this. So what you're referring to is an example of this, actually.
Okay, that's very interesting, and I did have some questions about that. If Skag, did you want to?
The only thing I wanted to add is I think it's a legal mystery as to why this was not clarified in the Constitution, but I find the moral argument to be pretty interesting too. When you have a club that you can't leave, a place or a group with whom you must associate, you can't leave that association. We would call that what? False imprisonment,
Soviet Union,
kidnapping.
That's why I make the point in my video. I mean, it is structured the same way the Soviet Union was. You're not allowed to leave once you join. Whereas, hilariously enough, the Soviet Union did, albeit they were struggling with their shit at the time, but they did eventually allow some states to leave when they were in decline without civil war, which is more than you could say for Abraham Lincoln. And I'm not sure there's a worse indictment of our country's behavior during the Civil War than the fact that Soviet communist Russia actually wound up being less violent in secession than we did.
Yes, I think that's definitely true. I hear constitutional conservatives talk about a return to constitutional values and what has been enshrined in the Constitution constantly. And I think it's a point where Skag and I differ a little bit. I don't want to misrepresent your opinion on this. But I was wondering what you think about a return to constitutional values, how is that going to help us? We've gone from a small decentralized government to absolute unfettered spending, largest, most bureaucratic government in the history of mankind. Do you believe that a return to founding values would save the country, or is a total restructuring in order?
We came really close to a moment where we could have reoriented states' rights to the center of government, and it was just in the past few years. This is why January 6th scared the living shit out of Washington.
Yeah.
It wasn't because of a bunch of grannies waving Walmart flags or a bunch of boomers with bear spray. It was because if Mike Pence had pulled the trigger, then we would have sent the election back to the state house delegations, and the states, as is supposed to be the proper procedure, would have decided whether Biden was the president or not. Now, mind you, I think they probably would have decided he was, but that would have been the single largest power grab back to the state level from the federal level in like 100 years. Like an insane, and that honestly is why they still demonize January 6th. And it's hilarious because it would have been benign for their political purposes. Right. Biden probably would have remained in the White House. It wouldn't have actually changed who was the president, but it would have forever altered. Okay, it would have been basically the states throwing their weight around and saying, okay, at the end of the day, we're the ones who sign off on these elections, and that's really how this is supposed to work. Because from that point on, you can take that same road to, okay, maybe now senators are appointed the same way they used to be. Maybe we wipe out that amendment. Maybe we, these are examples of state level rights that have steadily eroded away. I mean, you kind of have the 1-2 punch. A lot of people will blame Woodrow Wilson for things like income tax and, the draft and so forth, and not realizing that Lincoln is
Lincoln, right? The
original, right? And Wilson gets blamed for the sins of Abraham Lincoln. He basically was Lincoln come again.
Right.
It's hilarious. So like that, the 1-2 punch of those two guys sort of took a sledgehammer to states' rights, really, at the end of the day.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't see a way out of our current predicament without a national divorce. In many ways, we have even less in common with modern leftists than the North and the South had outside of slavery. And in many ways, not even that. For the most part, they lived similar lifestyles. Their lives were focused, somewhat agrarian. They had the same social expectations, reliance on family. What has the precedent of the Civil War done to our prospects of modern day secession?
Obliterated it.
Eradicated them, right?
I mean,
there's no possibility that we're going to be able to secede.
Oh, status will let it slip sometimes. Do you remember that clip from a few years ago where Beto O'Rourke was doing that town hall and the guy mentioned that the Second Amendment was meant for being able to overthrow your government if it becomes too corrupt? In that famous clip where Beto said, well, the question of whether you're allowed to rebel against your government was settled in a courthouse in Appomattox after the Civil War. They'll let it slip if you just lead them in that direction. They are eminently aware of the importance of Abraham Lincoln and his administration. It's not about what a great guy he was. And there are positions that I agreed with Abraham Lincoln on, as I'm sure everyone here does. You know, all of his political positions weren't completely odious. But
in the absence of conventional methods to secede, do we have any options for a national divorce? That's what I should have asked you.
I think reorienting a grand reorientation toward state level power would require something like another convention of states, which you could do. You absolutely could do. If you got enough red states that are sick of what's happening, you could absolutely convene another convention of states. And what are the blue states going to say? No. Like, why? It's not like a declaration of war. You know what I mean? It's diplomatic. It's meant to resolve a problem. I could see that. And a lot of people are advocating for that at present. So I could see that maybe. I'm not sure that would work. I haven't thought long and hard about it, but it could possibly.
Do you think might just say nope?
Yeah, they might actually.
Like, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the idea and the movement. Yeah. But how many times have we seen this administration outright say, even, I don't have the legal authority to do this. I am still going to do this until the courts or someone tells me not to. But sometimes that doesn't even matter. Which is a commonality they share with Lincoln. Incidentally, the subject of this, he repeatedly stated, I don't have any constitutional authority to act for or against on slavery. Right? He's the one who said that. Which incidentally, one of the common counter arguments of the argument that the Civil War wasn't primarily about slavery, which is my argument. I do think it was a cause, but not the cause. Is that, look at all the times that they mention slavery in their declarations of secession. This is a tired old chestnut. This is an old counter argument. And of course, it's ludicrous because two things. It's conflating, as I mentioned earlier, the secession crisis with the Civil War, but it's also deliberately omitting the context of why slavery was mentioned so many times. The Republican Party was not founded, as you will hear from the defenders of Lincoln, to end slavery. It was founded to end slavery in new American territories. And that was for economic reasons.
The Emancipation Proclamation didn't even free all the slaves.
Yeah, and in all the areas where they still held control, I mean, William Seward, the Secretary of State and the Himmler of the Abraham Lincoln administration, famously stated that we show our sympathies with slavery by liberating slaves where we cannot reach them and holding them in bondage where we can, which is really his assessment of the Emancipation Proclamation. And that was not an uncommon view. Both of Lincoln's secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolai, both said it was a war. Lincoln had said it was a war measure only, and it was basically just optics. And I mean, really, at the end of the day, that's what it was. But that really is kind of where the causes of the secession and Civil War kind of, you get this muddled kind of mass of, well, they mentioned slavery a few times, and therefore that was the cause. They were complaining. And in fact, the Fugitive Slave Act is, I think, the only law that is mentioned by name in any of those declarations of secession. The Fugitive Slave Act, which you referenced earlier, turned into a giant bureaucratic money pit and a huge racket. The law that she referenced, where people were taking payouts, basically, over slaves that were apprehended in the North. They were complaining about that, even though it was benefiting them. Even though it was benefiting the South, they were complaining about it in their declarations of secession. Why were they doing that? Because they didn't want any federal law to either abrogate or to legitimize the institution of slavery. That's why, even though Abraham Lincoln mentioned in his first inaugural address that he supported the Corwin Amendment, which would have made slavery permanent, the South still seceded. Right. And Abraham Lincoln, by the way, it turned out Doris Goodwin wrote a fantastic book several years ago that I read as research for my video called Team of Rivals. It was all about Lincoln's generals. She uncovered primary sources, private communications between William Seward and Abraham Lincoln ahead of him assuming the presidency, that explicitly proved that Abraham Lincoln didn't just support the Corwin Amendment. He was actually the uncredited author of that amendment. He wrote it himself, and then he lied in his first inaugural address and said, "Oh, I just heard about this amendment. Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. If you want to go ahead and pass it, that's fine, but whatever," right? He actually wrote this damn thing. That turned up in her book, by the way. I highly recommend that. It's a bit fawning, but 1,000 pages of really interesting information.
Have you come across a lot of personal correspondence with Lincoln and Marx in your research?
He never corresponded that I can see. Apparently, Marx wrote to him, right? Marx wrote to him, and you can see why he would. They both believed in the. You can see why they both believed in the appallingly retarded labor theory of value, right? It's hilarious. People get all out into the weeds. Oh, Abraham Lincoln must have corresponded with Marx. Man, I don't give a shit if he corresponded with Marx. That doesn't bother me in the slightest. You can write letters to anyone. Gosh, I would write letters to commies right now just to see how utterly deranged they are. What is much more of an indictment of Abraham Lincoln is he believed the same bullshit Karl Marx did, and he repeatedly stated as such, right? There's a famous quote from, I think it's his debates with Douglas, where he said, the securing for laborers the complete product of their labors is the most important function of all government, unquote. That's the labor theory of value, gang. Like that's pure Marxism.
Yeah.
So good times.
So what do you think? Let's try to steelman some of the basic arguments that you're going to come across, and that what is his name? DiLorenzo.
DiLorenzo, yeah. His books, I highly recommend. He did Lincoln Unmasked, which is kind of a pamphlet. It's really good if you want to get into like the corruption of Lincoln. It's a pretty quick read.
He did the real Lincoln as well.
The real Lincoln is probably his magnum opus. It's a tome, and it's very painstakingly sourced and pretty good. And I believe he also did a book called The Problem with Lincoln as well. But he's like a Rothbardian sort of he's an economist, right? Like he's known for being more of a libertarian economist. And this is one of the reasons the whole lost cause thing is a giant straw man. Like most of the most articulate and vociferous opponents of the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, the sort of dismantlers of the Lincoln myth, come from these libertarian circles. They could not be less in sympathy with the enterprise of slavery, right? And yet they're cast
Can you
as
just
these
define that term
Confederate
for me real quick? I'm sorry to interrupt, but when people reference the lost cause, I feel like I kind of understand what that is, but I'm not sure exactly what that means.
It's this idea that in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, through a series of writings from Jefferson Davis, who had been the president of the CSA, and a few other people in his administration. I know the vice president of Jefferson Davis's vice president, whose name escapes me right now, wrote some books in the immediate aftermath of the war. That as a result of these writings, this mythology, similar to kind of how Lincoln was mythologized, you can see there's a bit of projection happening here. There was this grand myth of, well, gosh, watch A Birth of a Nation. There's a good example of lost cause myth, right? The idea that, well, they all fought for this noble cause and they just fell short and so forth. And that it really wasn't about slavery. It was about the grand cause and so forth. Of course, there's a grain of truth wrapped up in that straw man, right? That clearly states rights were an issue, or else secession never would have been necessary. There wouldn't have been a rejection of the Corwin Amendment. There wouldn't have been a rejection of a number of different measures that could have actually ended the Civil War and also ended slavery, but wouldn't have resulted in the South being independent, right? So these kind of countervail against that notion. but the sort of lost cause is this sort of mythologized idea of that. The problem, of course, is that the more you read about the lost cause and the more books you read about the lost cause, you realize that, yes, there were initially some writings that I would say were Confederate cope, right? And I read some of them. I would call them Confederate cope. They really weren't influential enough in their own time to create the lost cause myth. The lost cause myth comes from Northern academia. And here's why that is. The South prosecuted their case against Abraham Lincoln through hails of bullet spray, right? They fought a war, and that question was resolved in military fashion. We just talked about how Lincoln arrested 13,000 Northerners, about how he jailed his political enemies, how he deported them, how he suspended habeas corpus, how he ordered the military to fire on civilians during the draft riots, right? The North had just as many problems with Abraham Lincoln as the South. Their cause was never resolved. Those people who got arrested, they never had recourse. There was never anyone held to account. And so I believe what happened, and this is my personal interpretation of it, judging by what I've read, is that that case sort of got prosecuted through Northern academics who began to sympathize more and more with the South and the Confederates. And so they read many of these Confederate texts and then began to lionize them, right? So you end up with Woodrow Wilson, who I describe in my video as a Northern academic. I don't describe him as a Northerner, folks. I'm aware of where he was born. But he was educated, indeed overeducated in the North. He wound up being the president of Princeton, right? This is significant. He winds up screening A Birth of the Nation in the White House. Right? This is kind of, if there is a lost cause, this is where it comes from. And people who are advocates of, or really who have problems with Abraham Lincoln, the top-hatted tyrant, they are some of the most vociferous denouncers of the lost cause. It is a giant leading straw man that is meant to reflexively hand wave away anyone who correctly points out the tyranny of Abraham Lincoln. I asserted that in my video. I steadfastly assert it today.
What other positions are you being presented with? I didn't watch this guy's rebuttal video. Skag, you did though?
I went through it because I wanted to gather up all the gotchas, but you know
it's a lot of pointing out either a typo or correctly pointing out a misstatement. You have to remember, I don't script my videos, so I'm flying off the top of my head, and sometimes you're going to conflate things.
That's incredible. I don't know how you do that.
Yeah, but I use bullet points, right? So when you're doing that, you're going to make errors. So I'm not above reproach. But most of it is niggling nonsense. It's, John Quincy Adams was the first founding father president, not Andrew Jackson. It's like, really, John Quincy Adams, the guy who was raised from birth by one of the founding fathers to be the president of the United States? He's the dividing line between the founding fathers and the non-founding fathers? Blow it out your ass. But anyway.
The best points that I collected.
Before, by the way, this is not an uncommon opinion.
The best points that I collected, you're so well prepared that you pretty much touched on all of them, if not confronted them directly.
They're really old talking points. That's the thing. I didn't want to really
this
make
one.
Sorry.
Go for it.
Oh, I didn't really want to make a full rebuttal because I hate clapback style videos. Yeah. But I do plan to make an addendum where I address a lot of the more common, not even from that guy, but just from people in the comments or whatever who have had counterpoints, some of which are valid or partially valid or whatever and should be considered, right? Like, I'm not above debating this topic. But I would like to make a video where I talk about some of the things I wasn't able to touch on in the Abraham Lincoln video, such as what she referenced earlier with the railroad corruption. I mean, that is a yawning pit of corruption that is unbelievable. He literally bought, sorry, I have to touch on this. I'm sorry. I know I'm getting sidetracked, but he bought stock in a city, right, in Illinois, just bumfuck middle of nowhere. No one would go there for any reason. Ahead of becoming president. As president, he makes sure to reroute the railroad
to his personal property in Ohio, right? Yeah. Yeah,
so
what
that
an asshole.
Personally profit from it.
Right.
Just unbelievable.
And I think he amassed an insane amount of wealth from that.
Yeah. So I do want to talk about things like that because there's a whole mountain of them that I really want to touch on. And then what I was going to do is have a separate section where all the kind of greatest hits of the refutations of my video are sort of listed.
Well,
because
people make these
some are
incredible
valid.
allowances for Lincoln that they would never make. They're like, well, it was a different time and people behave differently. I'm like, none of this works when I talk about Hitler. People never make those allowances, but they do it for Lincoln all the time.
Never mind Hitler. People won't make allowances for people like Woodrow Wilson.
Right.
Or, like they'll bash other presidents who do the same thing, or FDR, who obviously engaged in quite a bit of authoritarianism himself. There are presidents.
I know we're about at time. Oh, sorry. Did you have more?
No. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I know we're about at time, but there were maybe two challenge points that I think stood out that I'd like to talk about a little bit if we have time, but if we don't, that's fine as well. We good? Okay. So you mentioned the Corwin Amendment, and I thought this was interesting because I was not aware of this piece of history, but correct me if I'm wrong. This would have shielded slavery from any federal involvement, left it to the states constitutionally.
Yeah, basically would have made it permanent. Yeah.
Okay.
And permanent constitutionally.
And this is what you were referencing as Lincoln having written, right? Did you mention that earlier? Or was that something else?
It turns out through primary sources that, yes, he was
surreptitiously, right.
It was at least one of the uncredited authors of the Corwin Amendment.
So a partial author.
And lied about it in his first inaugural address.
So in your video, you said, this was set to pass through the states. It had passed Congress, if I understand correctly. And then the South seceded.
The votes to pass it. They had the votes to pass it. It had not passed yet because he was kind of holding it in abeyance, I think.
Got it.
Plus, you were in the middle of a secession crisis, but it was sort of looming there, right? And that's one of the reasons Abraham Lincoln mentioned in his first inaugural address it was like, if we can stave off this Civil War, we'll go ahead and pass this. It was kind of like a carrot and the stick kind of situation. A little bit.
So in your video, you said, well, hey, that's demonstration that this was not about slavery because there was this movement toward slavery toward resolving the issue that was making progress. And yet secession still happened. So why is that?
They seceded after that.
Right. Yeah. And the counter that I heard is that, no, this actually proves the war was about slavery because this was a concession from the North, understanding that the South cares exactly about slavery. And that's why this gesture was offered. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, the North was a slave state too. So this was actually a placative gesture on both sides, right? So, but regardless, it was and actually I referenced it earlier. The Lincoln was reacting, right, to these stories out of England, the newspaper story that I mentioned earlier about if we could break the Confederate blockade and all of these things, right? He was reacting to these stories because he was trying to take the lead on an issue that was already there, correct? Like he's basically trying to not allow, he's trying to preserve his territorial and tax monopoly, right? This is like fundamentally the problem. Lincoln comes to the table with a lot of things, not just the Corwin Amendment, but the amendment that would have paid manumission, the one I referenced earlier, that would have ended, by the way, in the 1920s. He had rolled out this manumission plan that would have started in the 1860s and wouldn't have ended until the 1920s. So that was sort of his response to that. He was not so much responding to the South, he was responding to the press from overseas. And the hilarious part is, in order to embrace the argument that only the South was instigating this war, again, you have to dismiss the English press. And yet, Abraham Lincoln is here reacting to the English press. And then later, of course, the delegations from the border slave states wind up going on record as confirming that the South were actually considering ending the practice of slavery. And again, all of this doesn't really matter because at the beginning of my video, what did I say? And gosh, I think this is the only thing I repeated 3 times in the whole video. The South don't have to be good for Lincoln to be a tyrant, right? Mm-hmm. This is like the point of the video is Lincoln is a tyrant, not that the South were good. So even if we had conceded the entire argument that slavery was the sole cause of the Civil War, it wouldn't make the suspension of habeas corpus without consent of Congress and arresting 13,000 of his own citizens and on and on and on. It wouldn't make that correct, right? So this is, from any direction you assail this refutation doesn't make sense.
This last point comes off as very simple, and in ways it is, but I think that it actually has really interesting pieces of philosophy behind it. So the Confederates fired the first shots, as though that settles everything. But you mentioned earlier there were all sorts of steps taken.
Apparently there were.
Yeah.
Apparently there were shots fired just before, incidentally.
Oh, okay. Well, I think it's usually the premise is the Confederates shot first, therefore they are responsible for the aggression. But as you were referencing earlier, there were all sorts of actions taken at Fort Sumter that led up to that. And I think the interesting debate there is what types of aggression or how severe does the aggression have to be to justify that sort of defensive action, if you want to characterize it that way. It's not as simple as if you didn't shoot first, you're not bad.
Well, there was a captain out of Florida. What is that guy's name? I can't remember the guy's name. There's a captain out of Florida who was stationed actually with the Union. This is a Union captain now, who was part of a troop landing on the same day as Fort Sumter. And he testified years later, and the press picked up his story, and it was a big embarrassment. They had to kind of cover it up, that the order to land troops in Florida had actually preceded the shots at Fort Sumter. So this was kind of a plan that was already in motion. Again, my argument is not that it's okay that the South fired on these people, although at the end of the day, there were no fatalities. It wasn't like it was a horrible, right? Like it was property damage. But still, at the end of the day, it was a situation where Lincoln could have drawn down matters. He could have offered a plan for manumission that would have worked, not the ridiculous one that he offered that I just referenced earlier. But that wouldn't have preserved his taxation and territorial monopoly. Allowing the South to remain independent was not something he wanted. Because, again, I referenced earlier, the South had the fourth largest economy in the world. The North needed a part of that action, just like the rest of the world did. He didn't want to have to pay more and not accrue the benefits of the South's economic production. Now, there's questions of whether that was sustainable. And of course, if slavery had turned into serfdom and the serfs had been freed, who knows where that economic production would have gone. I've never argued that slavery wasn't a big part of the South's economy, but definitely that was a consideration. Really what happened, I mean, the Providence Daily Post on April 13th, 1861 said something like, for weeks and weeks, the administration newspapers were assuring us that Fort Sumter was going to be abandoned. And of course, the reason they would do that is because that's what had happened up to this point. All the military forts, which were in Confederate territory, were being abandoned and evacuated. And then it followed up with, until Mr. Lincoln saw an opportunity to inaugurate a civil war without appearing in the character of the aggressor. This was not an uncommon view. It wasn't just Democratic publications. Publications in England, publications in France, publications all over the place absolutely saw through this. But it was, I think it's kind of a combination of factors, but mostly I think the assassination of Abraham Lincoln really, really had a part to play in whitewashing a lot of this negativity. Because once your president dies, even if you don't like him, it's like, you just killed our president. We have to we have to circle the wagons, right? We have to rally around him a little bit. And so none of this really was discussed after this point. And of course, now the modern cult of Lincoln have to reflexively dismiss the English press in its entirety.
Yep, of course. I think you did such a good job dismantling all of the major points in your video.
I didn't touch on the big ones, and I'm also lacking some of the context for some of the rebuttals that were provided.
Will you be making a follow-up video? I think people are eager.
I will. Yeah, I definitely need to touch on the slavery being the primary reason for secession and stuff like that. And like those points, I touched on it a little bit, but like, some of those big points definitely need to be replied to. They're not they're so old, you almost feel like you don't need to, but unfortunately you do. Like the Lincoln has been lionized to such a unique, like superheroic degree. It's kind of absurd. Like,
I think you do need to talk about it. It only seems obvious to you because you've done so much research, but you have to think about what elementary school children are learning about Lincoln.
right.
I mean, you have an entire lifetime of propaganda to undo in the normie population, and I don't think that your information could be too basic for those people. So we would love to see a follow-up video for you. This has been our guest, RazörFist. Thank you so much for joining me. In the description, I have linked his video, his sources, and all of his contact information. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Godspeed. Thank you for having me on.
Bye, guys.